Welcome to Sicuro Conversations, where we engage thought leaders, business influencers, and policy shapers. My name is Sheila Kamande, and our guest today is Hubert Kinkoh. He's a subject matter expert in the areas of security, governance, and politics. Welcome, Hubert.
Thank you very much.
Maybe you can introduce yourself and the work that you do, so that we can get to understand a bit more of your background and how it is relevant into risk and the Sicuro Conversations.
Thank you very much. My name is Hubert Kinkoh. My background is in the governance of peace and security in Africa. I am very interested in understanding how external influences, whether it's geopolitical, what I call geopolitical gymnastics, or armed conflicts, how they impinge on African states and people, how armed conflicts, whether happening in Russia, in Gaza, but also within the continent, affects development outcomes for African societies and states. So for the last 12 years, it's been my business to track political, military, socioeconomic developments across African states, to produce analysis on these issues, and based on this analysis to be able to advise different kinds of stakeholders on intervention options, whether within Africa or elsewhere.
Great. All right. So you've mentioned that you're in the research area of Africa's political and economic and security dynamics. So perhaps you can maybe tell us what, from your research and from your perspective, what are the biggest risks that are shaping how businesses and governments are interacting on the continent?
This is a very interesting question.
Yeah.
Because I think mainly there's a tension, right, that exists between an old, often asymmetrical way of engaging between African states and other actors and businesses within the continent and from outside, and a new, more assertive way of engagement. And within this tension, there are lots of risks, that are emanating. And I think, the first risk that comes to mind for me is the risk of persistent political instability.
Yeah.
And unconstitutional changes of government that we're witnessing across Africa. Over the last few years, we've seen between 2020 up to 2023 cases of military leaders coming, to the stage as, presidents in different countries through unconstitutional means, right? Whether it's in Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger or Gabon. And what this does is that it creates a certain level of uncertainty for businesses, right? In Burkina Faso, for instance, we've seen the renegotiation of mining contracts. We've seen the same for all the states in the Sahel. And this uncertainty is not good for business, right? It means that businesses have to recalibrate how they operate. They need to renegotiate terms. In some cases, their engagement has had to be canceled. And so, political instability is really not good for business. And we're seeing this risk, come to the fore a lot. On the second level, we're seeing a risk in terms of the shifts that happen in terms of geoeconomics. In the past, African states have been viewed almost as though they were passive actors, passive partners in their engagement with other actors. But this is shifting, right? African stakeholders, whether state or non-state actors, businesses as well, are realizing that they can choose what partners they engage. They can set the terms. They can negotiate better terms of their engagement. And so we're seeing a movement away from Western partners towards non-traditional partners like the Gulf states, other actors from the global south, China, Russia, and each of them brings something else. But what this creates in terms of risk, Sheila, is an avenue of competition, and competition brings a lot of complexity when it comes to business operations. So this, I would say, is a second risk. But interestingly, the third risk, and I think this is a very interesting risk, is that the risk of socioeconomic pressures. I mean, we don't need to look so far to see how this plays out.
Yeah.
Questions of high inflation rates, pressures that come on the cost of living, questions around massive youth unemployment. Despite the growing numbers of young people in across various African democracies, the ways in which governments fail to integrate these youth population into their development plans is a major risk, right? So the grievances that are emanating from failed or failures of governments to deliver to the people is actually causing chaos, and bringing about a bit of instability for businesses. In Kenya, in June 2024, we've seen how young people have gone to protest against what was, the perception or the reality that the government's needs were already on the necks of people. Increased taxation, right? We saw this also play out in Nigeria in 2020, right, with the EndSARS protest. We're seeing this not only in Africa, we're seeing it in Nepal, right? So it's almost like a global movement where young people are increasingly mobilizing around socioeconomic issues, forcing their governments to think or rethink how they engage. This is going to be, in future, a serious question when it comes to risk, and businesses suffer as a result. When protests take place, you know that a lot of businesses come to a standstill, right? In some cases, businesses have to evacuate their staff. This is not good for the business environment. But finally, just to close on that point, I think a major risk is going to come from climate-related pressures. For so long, the conversation has been had about how important dealing with climate pressures is. There have been movement on so many levels with the Coups, with the African Climate Summit, the most recent happened in Addis a few weeks ago, on why governments and peoples need to begin to adjust the way they relate with the environment. But climate change issues are not just environmental issues. They are political, and they also have operational risks, implications when it comes to businesses. Because this is why now in so many businesses we're talking about ESG, climate change is at the center of a lot of operational calculations of so many businesses. And so these are some of the risks that I see, emanating between businesses and governments that, within Africa have to be looked into.
Okay.
Yes.
You've mentioned some countries have, had unconstitutional waves of changes, especially in the West and Central Africa.
Right.
So how can businesses in those areas, or even those other areas that haven't had that, anticipate the kind of risk and preparedness that would help their businesses?
This is interesting. So just to give a bit of context.
Yeah.
If you look at the political climate of, let's say, West Africa over the last 5 years, in the context of constitutional or unconstitutional changes of government, you realize that even prior to 2020, there had been a lull in the waves of unconstitutional changes of government. If you go as far back as the post-independent days, between 1960 and 1990, almost every 10 years, you will realize there were at least 40 coups, right? Successful or attempted or failed.
Yeah.
After that period, from the 2000s to the 2010s, that figure halved, right? And then at some point in 2007, for instance, there was no coup. There were some years where there was no coup. And then in 2020, coups actually came back. And we saw, I think just in the span of 3 years, we saw about 9 coups happen. 2 in Mali, 2 in Burkina Faso, 1 in Niger, 1 in Gabon. There are other coups that came up. I mean, I'm not sure, in terms of the specifics, but nine coups and several attempted or failed coups. So it took a lot of businesses unawares, unfortunately, but some were prepared. For those that were prepared, I think what actually helped was that the intelligence gathering centered local agency, right? That they were able to have connections within the community. They engaged community leaders. They engaged local civil society. They had friends, right, within various neighborhoods. And these connections enabled them to be able to stay in touch with the realities as they were shifting. And so every coup, before it happened, there was always a sign, right, that it will happen. So they picked up on these signs as soon as they emerged. And one of these signs, Sheila, is that when you look at contexts like Burkina Faso or Mali, certain breakdown in the setup of governance is already an indicator that a coup is likely, right? Of course, governance dysfunction is something that is commonplace amongst many African contexts, but not everyone translates into a coup. The question and the challenge for businesses then is, how do you treat that information as though a coup would happen, right? Some would ignore them. In contexts like Sudan, for instance, it was ignored, right? The warning was there amongst, the diplomatic networks and businesses, but some of them ignored. In Niger as well, the signs were there, and a lot of businesses ignored. But when the coups then did happen, then they were faced with questions like evacuations and all these things. So I think, for me, at the heart of this question is that businesses have to make sure that they are in touch with local realities. They are reading the signs of the time. When governance dysfunction begins to shift in ways that make them uncomfortable, they should not ignore those signs, right?
No. So what should they not ignore, and what should they do at that point when they can see the signs of a coup coming? What should businesses do? Should they evacuate? Should they stay still? Should they, from your perspective, what should they do?
Well, I think that sometimes evacuations should not be rushed.
Okay.
We have seen in context, I'll take Sudan as a case in point. When the war unraveled in April of 2023, not many businesses were ready to move, right? Sometimes an evacuation is ill-timed, it's ill-informed. So just engaging as much as possible with the intelligence that comes from, local sources, for me, it's a starting point. If it is safe to move your staff, I would advise for the staff to be moved instead of waiting for, the unraveling of the situation like Sudan really showed. In a context, let's say like Kenya, when the protests were happening, a lot of embassies, issued, statements warning that the situation might actually turn, the risk levels were increasing. And so some embassies actually urged their staff to leave. Others, maintained that they will be calm shortly after the protest, and so there was no need for staff to actually move. It turns out that sometimes the intelligence gets it wrong, right? The intelligence sometimes escalates issues that should ordinarily not be escalated. And I think here, just again, making sure that you're reading the temperatures on the ground is really, really important.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Would you say that private companies such as ours, private sector intelligence outpaces diplomatic reporting in some instances, or perhaps you can give pros and cons of both.
Right.
In the sense of when they're advising investors who are already currently in the continent.
Yeah, this is quite pertinent because sometimes you can look at both as competing sources of information, right?
Yeah.
But actually they are complementary. I think though the private sector has a distinct advantage over other forms, especially in terms of the speed and agility in which it operates. I think first of all, private sector intelligence is agile, is purpose built in a ways in which diplomatic protocol cannot really meet, right? So on the one hand, there are political sensitivities that it can bypass, that diplomatically cannot be bypassed. If you look at the ways in which in terms of traditional diplomatic sources, if you look at the ways in which the bureaucracy is followed, that already gives private intelligence an advantage because sometimes it is more adaptive,
Yeah.
right? And it responds a bit faster to on-the-ground issues as they unfold than the democratic channels
Yeah.
actually can. Also, private intelligence has a different focus, right? It's business oriented. It's more business oriented, and sometimes quick thinking is good for business. This quick thinking we don't see the same within diplomatic circles. The ways in which diplomatic circles and sources of information are structured are such that sometimes it takes a longer time for approvals, to be got at capital or headquarters from different hierarchies. And yet, with private sector intelligence, I think they're more flexible in how in how authority
Yeah.
is given, to on the ground people to be able to act. And so in this sense, I see private intelligence as having, an advantage over diplomatic, very traditional ways of access to information. And I think private intelligence firms often have a more stronger grip on local networks, than diplomatic channels have. The ways in which they engage, diplomatic channels can be more elite focused, with very little, hands on the ground networks. But with private intelligence firms, I think they understand that local knowledge is actually value for money.
Yeah.
So they invest a lot in local networks, whether it's even civil society organizations and individuals who have access to information as it unfolds. But I also think that the financial incentive that drives the work of private intelligence firms is an issue that makes it tip over diplomatic sources of information because it creates this powerful drive, for high quality, accessible intelligence that, of course, diplomatic sources cannot.
Okay. So when we look ahead, which governance and political trends across Africa would you say businesses would most likely benefit from in their long-term strategy when they're dealing with governance and political trends? What should they be looking at?
I think there's a few trends that we observe nowadays.
Yeah.
There's a clear shift from managing a crisis to building strategies that are actually resilient, right? And this defines how businesses and governments will be moving in the years ahead. I think first and foremost, if you look at within African states, there is a rise of what I call resource nationalism.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at the ways in which non-traditional actors and even traditional actors are engaging with African states today, there's a movement from African states and businesses towards, I think I mentioned choosing their partners, but also managing resources in a way that benefits their people, right? Um, the ways in which the UAE and Saudi Arabia, for instance, are engaging in mining, in various countries across Africa, whether it's in the DRC or in Zambia or in the Sahel. What you notice as a common trend amongst the African governments is that they are ensuring that the negotiations of these contracts center local beneficiation, right? In the past, the case of DRC, for example, where decades of conflict have gone on because of minerals, that situation is giving lessons for several African nations, but even for DRC itself, that they need to do things a bit differently. The ways in which the DRC has now negotiated, the peace deal with Rwanda, mediated by Qatar, a non-traditional actor itself, shows the shift, right, towards making sure that there's resource nationalism, that resources that come from African countries benefits whoever, but also the African citizens themselves, right? I'm not surprised then that the government of the DRC should offer the United States a security for minerals, kind of deal.
Yeah.
The question is security for who anyway? Because sometimes, the governments can negotiate security for themselves, but not for the people, right? So there is this shift towards resource nationalism, and new partnerships will continue to define, the trend moving forward. Again, a second trend is, the fact of digital governance and tech-enabled solutions. Whether it's in taxation, for instance, that is very central to how businesses operate, right? If you should have a good business climate, it attracts a lot of businesses, but the lack thereof makes businesses, reluctant, to come and set up. If you consider, for example, the case of Ethiopia, for so long, until recently, businesses operating in Ethiopia could not, remit their profits out of the country because of the critical forex challenges that they have, and so it repelled businesses. It's only now that the Ethiopian government is opening up, liberalizing its economy, allowing for foreign banks to set up within Ethiopia, even allowing Safaricom,
Yeah.
to expand its options, even for mobile money transactions, right? So this is a trend that we're seeing, economic liberalization, and just tech-enabled solutions. In Kenya, it is easy for businesses to operate because, the iTax system on eCitizen, it's very easy to deal with, and you can process the taxation through this system. With the coming of artificial intelligence as well, we are seeing a lot of opportunity
Yeah.
for businesses as well, to engage and embed artificial intelligence in the ways in which they engage. I think one other trend that actually would, I would say, inform long term the way businesses and governments uh, engage in risk planning
Yeah.
is the increasing availability of information. And this is happening within a context where, of course, disinformation is being used as a political tool, right? But also within a context where, social media is taking over. And with that comes a lot of misinformation on the one hand, but disinformation, which is calculated, it's intentional. And so, uh, being used as a political tool, disinformation has the potential of shaping how businesses either thrive or they falter. So, for risk managers, the ability to be able to decipher between false information, and facts, is going to drive how successful or not their business engagements will be in future.
All right.
Yeah.
Speaking of trends,
Yes.
we have a new wave of very young leaders across the country, across the continent.
Yeah.
And whilst still maintaining a very old um, uh, number of leaders in the continent, would you say, and from your research and looking at the trends in these countries that have now had quite a number of new leaders who are young, would you say that their style, the style with which they rule or they lead, has a positive or a negative effect on businesses and investor? I think you had mentioned that earlier, but perhaps you can expound on that a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, interestingly, I think the new crop of leaders that we're seeing in Africa now are sort of, we're seeing a rupture, right? Instead of, on the one hand, we see rupture in terms of how the other leaders have been engaging, but on the other hand, we see continuity, right? So first, we see rupture in the sense that they want to be different. They know they're different and they want to act differently. So they are young. If you look at Senegal
Yeah.
as an example, uh, the, the leader in Senegal is a very young leader, and came up within a context of a lot of contestation, political contestation, and massive support, for new youthful leadership within that country. And so he's thinking in very youthful ways, which means that he's taking advantage of, some of the trends that we've talked about, whether it's social media, to showcase what he's doing. So there's more sharing of information. Senegalese have more access to what the presidency is doing than in the previous regime. They are also very business oriented, right? The ways in which they are negotiating deals is so different from the past, right? Accountability measures are in place. They are very transparent about the deals that they negotiate. And they're also making sure that these deals are beneficial for their own people.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a rupture in the sense that in the past, most of these, most of the African leadership negotiated deals that benefited them and the elites that surrounded them.
Yeah.
Of course, we're still seeing some of that, right? Which is why I say, on the one hand, there's rupture, and on the other hand, there's continuity. Unfortunately, we're still seeing, a crop of leaders coming up who maintain the status quo, right? Who, instead of breaking away from the lack of accountability and transparency, themselves are even reinforcing these structures, right? They are becoming less accountable. They are becoming less transparent. They are becoming more corrupt, even than those the predecessors. And so there is a tension, right? But we're also seeing that there's an engagement between the new leadership and the people that was not there in the past.
Yeah.
Right? Helped so much by the availability of information, access to social media, of course, but also a common, how do I put it? The common realization amongst people that the issues that bother one person bother the whole community.
Yeah.
And so we're finding a lot of social movements galvanizing around the same issues. This is why we are seeing a lot of protest activity coming up in different contexts, not just in Africa, but elsewhere. But also we're seeing that certain governments are engaging with the issues that are central to the protests, right? Whether they like it or not. In some contexts, in the Kenyan context, I think the government was forced to engage with the citizens when they protested. Did the Kenyan government like it? I do not think so. But did they do right to engage? Yes, they had no choice. And this brings us to the realization that state-society relationships, right, is going to be central to this new crop of leadership we're seeing in Africa. Gone are the days when states could just act independent of whether their actions had any repercussions on the citizens, on the people that they ruled. These days is the increasing realization that governments will be held accountable, right? And we're seeing that, materialize in so many contexts. Of course, in more authoritarian contexts, there's increasing repression, there's closure of these spaces where public participation can be encouraged. And so we're seeing less of rupture and more of continuity.
Okay.
But finally, on this point, I think that the question of realizing that the global multilateral order is actually fragmenting is one of the things that the new crop of African leaders, are actually recognizing and taking advantage of. I think in terms of African agencies, something that I've been talking about recently a lot,
Yeah.
African states are realizing that they are agents. They can influence outcomes. They can leverage. They can maneuver and even play states
Yeah.
against each other to get the kinds of outcomes that they need for themselves and for their people. And there's increasingly this happening. If you look across, whether it's from Rwanda, or of course, Rwanda is not new leadership, but it's a new context of leadership in the sense that the global order is not the same as it was in 1994
Yeah.
when the regime, came into power. So the leadership is adapting, to the context, right? The ways in which that regime in Rwanda is engaging, let's say Qatar, for instance, it's making sure that it's getting as much as possible out of that bilateral relations with Qatar. It may not be able to get as much from multilateral context as the UN and other groupings,
Yeah.
but bilaterally, it is negotiating better terms. It is ensuring that it is not a one-sided relationship. That the power asymmetry, though it may exist, it should be beneficial for both, countries in Africa and elsewhere. In Ethiopia, we've seen the same materialize where, the agency of the Ethiopian leader, of course, he's come into power since 2018. He's Ethiopia's new leader. Um, 7 years, it's not as old, right? So
Yeah.
he's still a new leader. And he's negotiating better deals. We're finding in Ethiopia now a lot of progress in terms of physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
And the funding for this comes largely from the UAE, right? In 2018, when Prime Minister Abiy took office, the Emiratis promised him $2 billion, to be directed at physical infrastructure and agri-business. And that money, or this investment is already yielding a lot of visible outcomes for Ethiopia. So they can negotiate better outcomes compared, to the old crop of leadership. If you look at contexts like Cameroon, if you look at contexts like Uganda, if you look at contexts like Equatorial Guinea, if you look at all these contexts where octogenarians, remain in office, they do not negotiate any better outcomes for their citizens anymore. Instead, they're trying to surround themselves with a few elites, to benefit out of these deals. If you even just look at the statistics in terms of the rate of borrowing,
Yeah.
right, whether it's from the IMF or elsewhere, you find that they borrow huge amounts of money that are not invested in the country, right? If you look at the amounts that are borrowed compared to the physical infrastructure, for example,
Yeah.
in these countries, the physical infrastructure is deteriorating. Every year, it is deteriorating, but, the cost of borrowing keeps going up.
Yeah.
So the new crop of leadership, you don't see this trend amongst them, right? Whether it is in Kenya, of course, Kenya is debatable, right? But you don't see this as overtly as you see in some of these contexts that I have mentioned.
So are we saying that changing guard
Yeah.
is good for a country?
Well, yes and no,
Okay.
right? Yes, because I think that leadership needs to be refreshed every
Okay.
time. The question is, after how long, right? So do 4-year terms guarantee fresh ideas? No, not necessarily. Do 7-year terms guarantee that? Not often, right? We've seen contexts where a change in leadership every 4 years, for every 8 years, because Some regimes now have to stay for 2 terms at least. So every 8 years, as the case may be, but there's no real change after those 2 terms have been served. In some contexts, you find, leaders who have been there for a long time, right? And there's significant change. And I know this is controversial, but the context of Rwanda is a case in point,
Yeah.
right? If you went to Rwanda 10 years ago and you went back there a month ago, you will see the difference, right? It's the same leader who has been there, right, for close to 3 decades, but there's visible change. In some contexts where there is a constant reshuffling of leadership, unfortunately, we cannot see the same, semblance of change. It can be a change of old guard, but not a change in the systems. In the end, Sheila, I think every leadership that is in place needs to guarantee results for its people. It has never mattered to me how long you're there.
Okay.
It has never mattered to me who is there. It has never, sometimes it has not mattered how you came into power, even. I mean, there have been military leaders in the past, right? Rwanda's president is a military leader. He came into office militarily, right?
Yeah.
But he's been able to deliver, in ways that some civilian leadership has not delivered. For me, in the end, it is always about results, not about who is there or how they came into power or how many.
In the case of Rwanda, I think they keep a very young, not just the national leader, but they refresh their cabinet, their local governments. So are we saying that it doesn't matter who is in power at the top, but it also matters who's in power surrounding the national power?
Yes, I think we could say this, but I think we should nuance it as well.
Okay.
Right? Because again, comparatively,
Yeah.
you will see that this can be true in some contexts and not so in other contexts.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what case to take. But you realize that government cabinet reshuffles sometimes are not to ensure service delivery.
Yes.
Oftentimes, it is to protect,
Yes.
a certain agenda.
Yeah.
It is to protect a certain regime in power. Sometimes it is also a reward for political loyalty, right? It does not necessarily guarantee results, or it's not even engineered to be able to guarantee results. In some contexts, the cabinet reshuffles are a means to just breathe in fresh air, into how government operates to ensure results.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you look beyond the cabinet to military reshufflements, the reshuffles are always a means to entrench regime stability, right? They're always a way to consolidate power. If you just look back in Gabon, when the coup happened, 2 governments reshuffled their military immediately. The government of Cameroon, the government of Rwanda, right?
Yeah.
Why? Because the same issues that led to the ouster of Bongo in Gabon were the same issues that created vulnerabilities within Cameroon, but also in Rwanda. So the reshuffle of the military leadership was a means to consolidate power. And it was not as though they were meant to guarantee effectiveness in how the military operates, whether it's in terms of provision of security or whatever. It was a means of power consolidation.
Okay. When we look 5 to 10 years from now,
Yeah.
what new security challenges are we looking at? Politically, technologically, geopolitically, or climate related? What can you say we need to get prepared for, especially for those in business, those looking to invest? What can they prepare for?
Well, they should prepare for all of those. I mean, like you've mentioned, whether
Yeah.
it's climate-induced security risks, or technological threats that will evolve from into a form of geopolitical warfare. And we're seeing a lot of that happening nowadays. But we're also seeing an intensification of proxy conflicts, but also like when we discuss the case of Kenya, we're seeing urban instability. So let me just talk about each of these a bit.
Yeah.
In terms of climate-induced, insecurity, there are threats that are emanating from how we are failing or falling short from managing, climate-related issues. And if you look at the Lake Chad Basin, for instance, the ways in which the states within that basin are now incapable of benefiting from such a huge water resource. The water resource is shrinking.
Yeah.
And what this does is it has ripple effects on even agricultural output. So irrigation, is directly affected. Fisheries are affected, for instance. And so we have direct threats on food security, also threats on economic security. And so companies now will need to adapt, their strategies to be able to center climate-induced security threats, because these also fuel a lot of things, whether it's cross-border displacements and the kinds of tensions that arise, between people on the move and host communities, right? So these have ripple effects on businesses. So no business should operate within a context without thinking about how, the linkage between climate change and security is actually formed. So this is one of the risks moving forward. The second risk, that I mentioned is how technological threats can actually turn into forms of geopolitical warfare.
Yes.
Right. So in 2020, I think there was a case in South Africa where there was a coordinated cyber attack, and this disrupted a lot of businesses. We've also seen cyber attacks staged at the level of the African Union, right, where a clear, state of unpreparedness allows for vulnerabilities that can be exploited, through cyber attacks. So in terms of businesses moving forward, I think no business should be able to downplay the importance of cybersecurity, right? Because systems are very vulnerable, and people, attack these systems for different reasons. So this is one of the threats that need to be factored in as well. A serious one for me would be, just the intensification of proxy conflicts.
Okay.
This is a major one for the mere reason that many contexts within the African continent have become a theater either of experimentation for external actors or competition, right? These contexts have certain commonalities. They are often rich in minerals. They are often very fragile. They are often poorly governed. And, this allows cracks that can be exploited by external powers. So take Sudan as a case in point, right? Various actors have stakes
Yeah.
in the Sudan conflict that is ongoing now. It's a regional conflict, for instance. It is not just a war being fought between, General Burhan and Hemeti. It is actually a regional war within, the East African region as well. Various member states, are picking sides and supporting different sides of the conflict. Beyond the African region as well, Gulf states, various Gulf states are also, stakeholders in perpetuating, the civilian rampage that we are seeing in Sudan. Why? Because the government is fragile. Of course, because there are mineral resources, gold, that they want to access, and instability allows for ease of access, without checks and balances, without accountability. So gold is being traded in the black market in a manner that benefits external powers instead of local Sudanese, for instance. And so this war in Sudan is not just a national, it's not an intra-state conflict. It is actually a geopolitical war. And so this is one of the things to keep an eye out for.
Yeah.
But also we've seen this also happening in places like Libya, in the DRC, in the Sahel, where in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, we've seen the entrance of, Russian mercenaries, Wagner Group, and now African Corps, under the pretext of protection,
Yeah.
right? We've seen other governments even invite Wagner Group to come and protect the presidency. We've seen this in Central African Republic, and this is already now playing out clearly in the context of the Sahel. The war in Libya as well. The two factions that are de facto governments in Libya, they have allegiances, right, with different external partners, and this sustains the war, unfortunately. And I think finally is the question of urban instability, right? Poverty is causing and sustaining a lot of movements towards urban areas. And, with a lot of access to information, people are more conscientized about rights,
Yeah.
about expectations. People are now holding their governments to account more than ever. And still, the tension between government and people, state and society, still exists. The gap in state-society relations continues to widen. And so protest activity, crime rates will continue, right, in the foreseeable future, unless this gap between state and society is narrowed. So this is another threat that, cannot be overlooked by businesses, because like we've discussed, protest activity halts businesses. In cases of vandalism, businesses stand to lose, right? And in any case, if businesses have to evacuate their staff, it is not a cheap process,
Yeah.
right? So these are some of the cases I can point to.
So with what you've said, how can businesses then build a resiliency to adapt to all those factors that you have stated, to be able to operate sustainably in Africa?
Yeah. I think I'll take you back to a point I made about access to local networks.
Yeah.
It's for me really fundamental, because if you're building your business around a local ecosystem, it really helps to avert these kinds of risks, because this guarantees you access to timely information, and it even allows for easy operation once there's a connection with local communities. And so for businesses, investing in these communities is paramount.
Yeah.
Right? Setting up a business in a community that only extracts actually is a cause of tension. When you invest in the community in the ways that is gainful, for members of that community, it's actually very constructive, and it allows for the businesses to operate quite efficiently. But beyond just embedding operations in a local ecosystem, I think another way for businesses to be resilient is actually to diversify risk, right? Whether it's from supply chains to the investment portfolio. I think diversification of risk has oftentimes proved to be a proper way to manage risk and to build a resilience, but also being proactive, right? In every sense, reactive responses have often proved to be a shortcoming in any case.
Yeah.
Right? If you wait for something to happen before you can respond or you can react, it proves to be counterproductive. So being proactive, helps a lot. But also finally building a very strong relationship with partners. Right? You diversify the risk, but you also diversify your partners.
Yeah.
And you make sure that the relationship that you're building with partners is solid, is based on trust, and that it's a win-win, for you and your partners. And so these are really important to build resilience for lots of businesses.
Great.
Yeah.
In your opinion, should businesses play a role in helping or assisting government reforms, or should they their mandate to be solely on their people and their assets?
This is a a great ethical debate
Yeah.
when it comes to businesses operating, and so there's a fine line to walk,
Yeah.
in the sense that for me it's a debate between two ideas, or two arguments. The argument about the duty of care, and the argument about leverage for good. So in terms of duty of care, I think a company's primary duty is really to its stakeholders, its shareholders, and its employees.
Yeah.
It is not to government, it is not to ensuring political reform, because that can be seen as an overreach.
Yeah.
And it can actually provoke tension, between the host government, where the business is, and the business itself. And so it can be actually counterintuitive and counterproductive. So in some cases, when you look at how much, big businesses, multinational national corporations have operated in some context, if they begin to be seen to be intervening in political issues, it breeds even questions around neocolonialism,
Yeah.
for instance, right? And this kind of, reputational risk is not good for any business. You need to protect the reputation of the business as politically independent, but not detached from the political realities, right? Because they themselves are affected by these political realities, which now introduces the question of leverage for good. And the argument literally thinks that businesses are powerful economic actors. And so you cannot ignore political realities, right? You may not engage in them, but investing in communities in such a way, for instance, that guarantees uh, positive outcomes for your business and the communities themselves is in itself political. It's a political decision, right? Because the issues that breed, vulnerabilities in communities mostly are economic, but sometimes turn to be political.
Yes.
And so in investing, economically in communities, businesses are addressing political issues, right? So it's a balance, right, between the duty of care and the leverage for good. But in the end, I would actually say that what path is effective lies in the middle, right? That businesses, again, cannot act as if they operate in a vacuum.
Yes.
There is always a political context that allows for businesses to operate smoothly, and the same political context can frustrate business operations, right? So the question of applying intelligence in such a way that balances between a political obligation and the central business of business operations itself is where the trick actually lies.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. So finally, if you had one piece of advice for any business
Yes.
or investor looking to invest in Africa, what would that be?
It's simple for me. Think beyond the headline, right? Invest in the local knowledge. I think the turn to the local is oftentimes not emphasized enough. Sometimes businesses operate based on intelligence that comes from outside, and yet ignoring the same intelligence that is easily accessible, that is fact-based, and actually driven by on-the-ground realities. So for foreign corporate businesses in particular, relying on a network of local actors, for me, is going to be the way to move forward. And it speaks again to the question that we just talked about building a resilient business model, right? I do not think that you can build a business model that is resilient and that is detached from local networks and the local realities. So for me, again, the call for the turn to the local. Yes, take the headlines, but make sure you're investing in local knowledge and networks.
Oh, great. So wonderful to have you, Hubert. We look forward to having you again.
Thank you very much, Sheila.
All right.
It was a pleasure.
Great.
Yes, asante.